Okay, internet. This is kind of related to comics, and I'm gonna get there. It's gonna start in YouTube video game talk, and it's going to wander all the way around. So pull up your pants and get ready. This is So, a lot of what I was thinking about started a little while ago when I was arguing video games with someone online who obviously I do not know because he was a freaking moron. Okay, so we were talking Metal Gear Solid 4. If you don't know, that's fine. But what you do need to know is that this guy was arguing that video games are not as primarily influenced by Japan as they are by America, which, if you understand the origins of video games, is really, to put it politely, bold claim. So anyways, he was arguing stuff about Metal Gear 3 and Metal Gear 4 a little bit because he's talking about cinematic references, blah blah blah, which is all inherent to the text. Okay, but what you do need to understand is that Metal Gear Solid 4 is a work that is very deliberately and signposted delivered in 5 acts. 5. Which I pointed out is a very Japanese influence, and he said, well, no, because da-da-da-da-da, and Aristotle's way of delivering it, and yeah, Shakespeare used the 5-act structure as well. However, the 5-act structure used is more similar, and he gave me some bullshit about not looking up on Google. If you type in 5-act structure into Google, one of the first things you see is something called the Johakaiu, which is different from the 5-act structure in that the 5th act is what would be considered the entirety of the falling action in normal, more Eurocentric storytelling, which is to say the last moments of the play, like the last few scenes, are instead an entire act's worth because that represents a certain moving on of life, a certain age, a certain experience. Also, the idea of 5 is a lot more central of a number to the understanding of Eastern than Western stuff, because obviously in Western it's more a rule of 3. Now, this drove me nuts. There was some other aspects going on here, but the guy was arguing that video games weren't more Japanese influenced is insane. But in this debate, in doing it and processing a little bit later, and me looking up this idea of the 5-act structure and what comes up first on Google, led me to this kind of notion of this idea, because this, in what he was saying, there's a certain obvious arrogance. Now, I'm not going to say I'm above that in any way by any stretch of the imagination, but it did lead me to the idea that when I hear people talking about a lot of this, people talk about cultural relevance, but at the same time, they're easy to snide, or some people are easy to snide the idea of pop culture, which led me to somewhere else. Now, what's interesting about the idea of the separation of that is that the original divide, which was something that happened in America during the days when there was definitely a kind of an origin of theaters before there were minstrel and whatnot, but there was one theater where a lot of the higher people went that were displaying one play about Britain and kind of how the British elite and all that were still, well, expounding British values as virtue. And I'm sorry, when I said America, I meant the colonies, really. And then there was the poorer one, which was the same play, but directed in a way that made it a parody of the other one, basically. And there's more details to it. Honestly, my memory is not 100% on this, but that that is the true dividing part, at least for America, of high and low culture. Now, low culture then slowly became what we know as pop culture, at least the parts that were more popular of it versus the ones that didn't take on as well, obviously. But as we go on in time, you start to see an interesting more divide of that, because now when you think high culture, it doesn't quite line up, because the main idea that we understand pop culture by now is cultural signifiers, media, movies, art, obviously comics, video games, anything you can think of that falls under these lines. Is to a certain expense web pages, though you can kind of get gray area and weird in how you want to define it there. That is pop culture. Now, when you think high culture, you think kind of like what? Opera, fine art, paintings, something of that nature. However, that's interesting because in a way, those have been kind of wrapped back into pop culture. Now, they're obviously... So we've kind of come back to this idea that culture is culture, and the idea of pop culture is just kind of what's ever digested en masse, and whatever the exact number is, I don't know, but there needs to be... I think the rough idea for pop culture is that your average citizen knows that it exists. Not that they know about it in a whole bunch of ways, but that they're aware of its existence. Like, your average person may not know a whole lot about comics, but they know they exist. Okay. So, my point is that we've come back to an understanding that pop culture is culture that is distributed on a certain level, which is interesting because that means the higher arts, something like a fine oil painting or whatnot, that can as easily be mass produced, and certainly because there's only original, and then each painting kind of has it is just a printing, and not something like in a museum or whatever, that lacks any impact on culture anymore, because it can't be as easily accessed. It's not something that's truly relevant anymore. You also see this with poetry in a way. The idea that you would need to read over, I mean, even a smaller poem, like, say, 25 lines or something, but you need to read it about 20 times to really unravel and get it, is something that's inaccessible. It's not part of the popular culture because it's not accessible. And in that sense, we still, like, you could argue a high and low class, but I don't think there's necessarily a lot of high class people arguing over poetry anymore. Like, you don't really hear about the poet laureate anymore. It's not something in our culture because it's not en masse. In a way, it's culture by democracy to a certain level. And yes, you can argue something's lost or whatever by all that, but that's kind of the way it is now. And so it's interesting that the it's kind of like more of the low class understanding, but in order to produce any of this takes kind of like a high class level of doing, because in order to make anything that's successful like that anymore, for the most part, you need gobs of money. Music, you're talking radio hits, movies, you're talking blockbusters. To produce a comic, frankly, for 20 pages stapled together, it's kind of an obscenely high cost to get it at any high level of understanding. And if you look at the way that image books succeed or fall, you'll understand that the numbers for 20 pages of art and some writing, it's still a really high cost to put it out. So by that, in a way, the lower culture, in a way that's digested in any way that's relevant to actually being culture, is actually more fan works, where you get fan films produced on a shoestring budget. You get like fan works, like fan comics put out for free, or web comics put out for free that aren't necessarily fan stuff, but it's kind of like that, or fan fiction or things of that nature. Even if you want to be kind of just an artist in order to gain a certain amount of notoriety on a lot of channels, you need to be doing pictures of characters or things that people recognize in order to get enough notice to start moving on to do more of your own thing, or at least that's the easier path. There's obviously exceptions, because there always will be, but there's that kind of thing. So it's less of a divide now between pop or not, or high and low, but it's more kind of like this professional versus fan sort of ideal. And so in order to be a connoisseur and kind of apply a certain level of education and culture to these things, you access the information, you look it up, and the access to the information is also cheaper too, which is a big factor, but it's also maligned because there's a limitation in free information that's happened. Not to... I don't want to rail against Wikipedia here or anything like that, because I actually think it's a very powerful tool. I think people just need to understand that it's limitation. It's the equivalent of basically an encyclopedia entry, which is the most cursory glance at a given subject. It's something to lead you in so that hopefully, if you're really interested, you can find more information. It's not supposed to be the end all. And there's a number of times when I'm trying to recall something from education and I look something up using Google or whatnot, I can't find it. I'd have to dig a lot longer, and I know this thing exists, but I can't remember the details. And unless I was so motivated and I knew that it was a thing, but I couldn't remember a date or whatever, then I wouldn't know to keep digging for the information. There's still a cultural zeitgeist that is filled that the internet does not provide, that definitely drives the hunger. And of course, I mean, that's part of the reason that we love these videos, right? You know, it's people talking about stuff, and you're not just going to get it all offhand. But that's a big thing, is now we have a lot of people who are proclaimed experts on all these things because they read some articles, and not that that's bad, but there's more to it than the cursory information. And we're getting a lot of people who, not saying we as in here, but just in general, we're seeing this divide of people who claim to know their stuff, who, honest to God, think they do, but don't. They don't understand it, because in order to be an expert on this anymore, to be an expert on popular culture, you don't actually have to go to an accredited school or something and be learned by professors and philosophies of and whatnot. You just have to spend a little while reading, and you think you will, because you'll know more than most, but you won't ever understand certain other aspects that might have been outside of that realm that actually do play a factor. And for that, you might miss entire aspects or entire readings of what you're reading, and that causes an interesting break in the way that culture used to be defined, and more the way we have it now, and honestly in a way we've had it for ages. And a big part of this came to me when I was having this debate with this guy, and I brought up the fact that, because all this was spurred by the idea of homosexuality in games, and this plays a huge part in comics as well, because I brought up the idea that there was this game that had aspects of Bushido in it, which inherently, especially with the way the swordplay was framed and moved in that game, that there was a lot of homoerotic imagery, because a lot of it was swords and the way that the blood splattered and all that. Like, and I'm not being too artsy-fartsy here, like, as if you understand that a lot of Bushido revolved around a way that a lot of Grecian ways moved, where in Greece and Rome they had man-boy love, which was viewed as human mastery over
kind of our more bestial, primal ideas, because obviously you have lust to procreate, and that's very natural and animalistic. To love someone of the opposite sex and to be with them was kind of viewed as a more enlightened thing. And also when you're dealing with a honestly sexist warrior culture, the idea of a man and a boy and then teaching them all that, and that all being wrapped up in it, makes a certain kind of sense. I'm not arguing that it's moral now by any means on that level. Not saying being gay is wrong. I'm just saying that was a thing, and a very known thing for that aspect of that culture. And when you're reading or ingesting media like this, you're not aware of those things and they're touching on it, and then you're arguing that there isn't any level of homosexuality in these things because you want to sound bright and enlightened, and you're blatantly missing a lot of it. Someone slaps you in the face with it and you don't know, but because you view yourself as an expert because you read some things, maybe it's a bigger problem. And so that's why it's kind of frustrating. And obviously this plays in with comics, especially when you look at stuff like, honestly, like Wolverine and the way he fights with the Silver Samurai, or even sometimes Sabretooth. There's stuff there that has some subtext if you're willing to read it like that, especially, again, with the samurai.
But kind of going back, if your media doesn't have any level of distribution, it can't really be culture anymore. And then the way that we interpret that is kind of malign, and it's a bit more divisive. And the way we break things down now is, like I said, kind of professional and fan, but it's also more by medium than I think it has been before. Not to say that, art critics don't need to be different than movie critics and all that, but there's a certain level of reading and understanding that was more ubiquitous. Now, most reviewers are just some guy with maybe some level of classical critical information. And it's less, which in a lot of ways is actually really good. It's more relatable. A lot more of it is like, is this movie good? Is it a waste of your time? Here are the things that they think someone would like it. Like, it's a bit more to the point and more to the piece than trying to frame it within some cultural standard. And frankly, less of analysis and more of a frank review. It is what we tend to get across the board no matter what you're looking at now. But the way we do it by medium shows. When you look at a movie review, there's some technical aspects, like I like the way it was framed or whatnot. If something pops out, you'll usually hear some sort of technical talk, and they'll usually frame a certain level of, like, if the special effects worked within the film or not, or if some effect was overused, or potentially, I've heard it, like, they wish that certain effects were used more in some cases, if that comes up. Like, there's a light amount of technical talk, and more of it is to the piece, and, like, if it felt, or if it just worked within its own rights, or if some other factor pertinent to the film doesn't come through. Like, I'm going to get to this a little bit more later, but, like, comparing the latest Wolverine film to the just prior Wolverine film and how they stack up, something along those lines. Whereas when you're looking at a video game, usually the way they break it down is they have an article, and then they kind of have a breakdown of certain things, like gameplay, and then they'll say graphics when they really mean art style, and then they'll say sound, and they'll rate that, and that number is usually really random and the most likely to go the lowest, because it's because they don't know what they're talking about half the time. And then they'll have like an overall score, and maybe they'll have some other subcategory depending on the site. But it's this very broken down thing, and it's a very technical thing. It's actually been criticized more and more in that realm, where nobody's looking at the piece. And this saying keeps coming up, like, the game is more than the sum of its parts. Which, half the time when people say that saying, I don't think they realize that just by saying it, it's essentially pointless. What do you mean the game's more than the sum of its parts? Like, if you have a reason to say that and you have some meaning behind it, fine, but people just throw it out and it doesn't make any sense because they don't verify what they're talking about. But when you hear people talking about comics, honestly, the way people talk about it on YouTube, if they're talking about not just showing their comic, like, they'll talk about whether they liked it or not, and it's a little hard to review because most comics are serial installments, so there's usually a bit of hesitation if it's not the end of the story, like, I like this, or this was a lump, but I see where it could be going, and it really could pay off later. Maybe it won't, we'll see. But there's a lot of talk about how you feel and whether or not it works, but what's interesting versus nearly any other kind of review is that there's almost no technical talk unless something really stands out. When people are talking about Elegy of Batwoman, back when that run was happening with J.H. Williams and Greg Rucka, you could really see a divide, and a lot of people talked about the layouts, and a lot of people talked about the use of, how the art really worked for the comic and was really unique. And I definitely heard a few people talk about how the colors were used and all that. But your average comic review doesn't talk about the average comic and how the colors were used, any specific bit about how the line work really affects the comics, how certain writing techniques employed actually affect and make a comic work or fail, how certain design aspects change in a character when it comes up. Like, usually you'll hear something like the costume changed, but not anything technical, like if something really happened. But sometimes, like with the whole New 52 coming in, all the costumes are designed. A lot of people are like, I like the costumes are mostly the same, but you don't hear people talking about, well, the fact that the lines are so pronounced make the costumes seem in a way more uniform, but also in a certain more militaristic, which really visually changes the tone of the character. You're not hearing statements along those lines as much. And it's just interesting to me, and I feel, I'm not saying one needs to change what they do, but I feel like, especially on YouTube, who fuck cares, but when you compare, like, what people say on YouTube about a comic versus a lot of these professional comic review sites or whatnot, there's more value in what the YouTube people are saying, if nothing else because they're not dependent on how they review and whether or not they get free copies in advance next week. They're going to give you their honest opinion, whereas a lot of this are more maligned and have to play parties and are caught up in all the bullshit and can't really say anything too negative about events, when honestly the collective whole is buying a lot of events but simultaneously worn down. And I think there's a happy medium where the events can sell, but if you leave to be on their own, that seems to be that's going to work best without pissing off nearly as people, though there's certainly Dragon's sale of it's connected so the numbers will spike momentarily. But then usually I think you'll notice it can kill the month after because it ruined the flow of a book a lot of times. So reviewing of comics is tied to the idea that it's a comic, but it still seems to be mostly frank. And it's interesting when dealing with something that's exposition of writing and art that people don't look at ploy techniques such, and that's not really the general mindset around viewing the comics, which is understandable because for the longest time comics have been
viewed as popular culture art sort of things, and it's definitely been viewed for long as one of the like lowest forms of art, which is really hilarious right now, because now when we look at what's the height of culture, the big
So what's really funny about film being the biggest thing is, as of now, and this is by no means my original thought, and I'm sure you can pinpoint to like 5 other people saying it, Hollywood doesn't know what the fuck they're doing. They ruin stories, and for the most part, they don't have an original idea to rub across the 5 fucking people in the boardroom or whatever. Most movies are based on a book, a video game, or a comic book, or an old TV show, or even more hilariously now, an old movie. Honestly, I'd love to see an infographic somewhere of someone comparing where the source material for movies per year came from in sort of a pie chart fashion kind of show. Like, what I'd really be interested in is how many original movie scripts of nationally shown films there were versus ones of different medium stuff coming out. Because when I think of the films that I've enjoyed, like I watched a few films this past weekend. It was a very movie-centric weekend, which is rare for me. But one was Lord of the Rings, based on a book. The other one was, or The Hobbit Part 2. The other one was Hobbit, which was same thing, but I'm not gonna... Okay. So, book. And then we saw James Bond movie, based on a book. Then we saw a Superman thing, based on comics, obviously. It was an animated feature, but whatever. And then we saw The Hunger Games, based on a book. Like, when I think about movies that I like, usually a lot of movies that I like tend to be movies that were movies. They're always intended to be movies. When I watch a movie, I tend to gravitate towards those. Imagine that. But it's rare. And obviously there's exceptions. I love Scott Pilgrim. I love the Ninja Turtle movies, whatever. But usually, you know, movies aren't movies. So what I find funny about that is the goal for a lot of comics is being a movie property or having the comic that leads to a movie. A lot of books are aiming for that. A lot of mediums, video games feel more validated when there's a video game movie. And a lot of video games aim to be more cinematic at the detriment of there being a fucking game in there. A lot of comics, especially Image comics right now, a lot of them are under fire for being designed and drawn and written in a way that's actually more storyboarded than graphic art. It's a valid complaint for the most part. You know, if you're enjoying the story, whatever. I'm not going to berate you for enjoying something. But I think if you're aware of that, I think it's a very valid criticism to look at that and think about the fact that this might be alright, but would this comic have been better if the artist wasn't using always a very standard blocky grid, but really kind of played with the page a little bit more? Not saying that they can't use the grid, but if they play with it in different ways. I mean, look, I'm not saying everybody has to be Eisner, but Eisner is comic history at this point, and you can look at him and employ his techniques because they're history, and frankly they're taught in comic book understanding classes, or frankly if you're just trying to be in the field and you don't understand some of the base techniques that Will Eisner did that change the landscape of the medium, you're not really playing with the full set of tools, because those aren't exactly breaking edge at this point. They're still amazing, and they're still great, but they shouldn't still seem as fresh as they do now. Like, those should be pretty rote at this point. So, yeah, so I feel like if there was a bit more understanding of the history and understanding of comics, if maybe we're a little bit more critical, which is why I love reviews that look at stuff a little bit more like that, which I will say Comics Alliance has been good about, and I just read a couple of interesting articles on there about, like, whether recoloring is really as valid as it should be, and a lot of it, and this is interesting, for a lot of you that have been talking about the Miracle Man reprints, apparently they've been recolored, and if you look at the page that they have in the article there, the old Miracle Man has a lot more, like, primary colors. There's green backgrounds. The newer one is much more brown and gray, and it's a lot more muted. It's a lot less expressive. And when you read the reasoning behind why they had it recolored, and that coloring has changed over the years because of this and the other thing, you look at it, and if you look at that recoloring, it looks less comic booky, and not necessarily in a gold corny age way, but I mean a lot of those colors and the way that they were used in the frames, I'm not saying like it was exactly this, but different colors express mood and have meaning, and if you know what they mean and you see an entire frame framed with one color in a background, and there's not like a drawing in the background, like it's basically just some lines and color, and the next frame is a different color and you get a slightly different reaction on the character, and that's paired with colors. If you're not drawing a little more meaning from that than an expression slightly changing and there's no colors in the background of the panel, I don't think you understand that there's more thought being put into the something that looks a little more surreal but is more artistic. And it's interesting, another big part that this article talks about is the fact that the colors and inkers and letterers are collaborators on these pieces as well, and often get forgotten and their work thought of as almost secondary, or like could have been done by anyone. Like, they're not really considered pieces of the puzzle as much, and I think it's important for us to understand that, and I think every medium kind of suffers from that, where certain aspects aren't necessarily as appreciated as they should be because they're not always as vitally important from every small piece to every small piece, but they do play a larger impact to the overall thing. For instance, I mean, when you're talking about like movies and you look at sound design, you may not be thinking a lot about the sound if you're not really paying attention to like how things put together. But if you ever have a chance, try watching some sort of film that you love with only dialogue. But the note I wanted to end on is I think a lot of people who are reviewing around here on YouTube and whatnot should really be proud of the way that we look at comics. I mean, most people on here just speak in their mind, which is something pure and intangible and nothing on the level of nearly half of what I've been talking about. But if you compare the way that books are reviewed here versus, like I said, professional sites, or even look at some of the professional YouTubers who look at comics. I was just watching a show called Variant today on YouTube, and the way he talks about comics lacks a certain amount of finesse, and in certain places, frankly, just knowledge, and is clearly just kind of oddly biased to certain characters, and more importantly, he was just talking about casting for a superhero movie, which is hilarious on two levels. Again, we're looking at movies as our validation when that is completely not needed, because movies clearly can't validate an idea of their own fucking cognition. But more importantly, he was talking about who would you cast for a superhero, and the obvious answer in every thing, unless it's a sequel, is you cast a relative unknown or an unknown as the main character for a very recognizable character, because otherwise it causes cognitive problems within the audience. Everyone knows that. Come on. Anyway. Should be proud of the way you're putting out the reviews, and keep doing it. And please, if any of what I've said has interested you and you want to maybe talk about something a little more technical, or maybe look up how certain aspects are done, like maybe think about like how inkers are, I need to know more about this, how certain inkers or letters really affect how a comic's put out, and maybe try to talk about that. And I probably won't end up doing a lot of that myself, because I'm just jabbing. But please, if that interests you, I'd implore you to pursue it. But if not, like I said, we're still ahead of the game. Just because we're beer of heart. And that's reviews and not analysis. Which is more of what I'm talking about, but no. So, very unorganized, way too long, all the YouTube sins as usual. If that's your style, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you're really feeling randy, feel free to send booze, comics. Pretty much been acceptable.